What's up, nerds? Welcome back to the channel Shoot Move Edit. In this video, we're continuing on into a short series that I'm doing on the basics, or the technical basics of photography. In the last video, we covered aperture. In this video, we're going to be going over shutter speed, what it is, and how we actually use it in photography. Quick disclaimer, any of the links that you see down in the description below, chances are they are going to be affiliate links. What that means is if you use those links and go to, say, like Amazon or something, and you actually end up buying something based on one of my videos, I actually get a small commission out of it, and it's at no additional cost to you guys. And anyway, back to the video. So what is shutter speed exactly? Shutter speed is the amount of time the film or sensor for digital cameras is exposed to light. It is the time from when the shutter opens, the sensor or film is exposed, and until that shutter closes. So the shutter speed settings on your camera are displayed in seconds or fractions of a second. An example of this is 3 seconds. That'll be shown as 3 with quotation marks or 2 apostrophes, whatever you want to call it. In fractions of a second, it'll be displayed as 1 slash and then another number. So for example, if you're shooting at 1/50th of a second, it'll be 1 slash 50, 1 over 50. Another example, 1,000th of a second. That'll be 1 slash 1,000, 1,000th of a second. So go ahead and take out your camera if you got it with you, and then just start playing with the shutter speed. So what you can do with this is go ahead and put your camera into shutter priority mode. If you're shooting on Nikon, that'd be S mode, or if you're shooting on Canon, that's TV mode. And then just start messing with the dial just to see how fast your camera can go and then how slow it can go. Some cameras, well, most cameras actually nowadays can go upwards to 1/8,000th of a second and even faster. Like the Nikon I'm shooting on right now can do that, and then so like my older Nikon camera can only go up to 1/4000th of a second. So check your camera, see how fast it can go, and then check how slow it can go, and just mess around with that for a bit. Now let's dive into how shutter speed actually affects our photography. So shutter speed affects two things, just like aperture, and what it does to our images. The first one is the amount of perceived motion that is captured, and the second one is the overall exposure of your image, just like aperture. So we'll go over perceived motion first. So the faster the shutter speed on your camera, the faster the motion that you can stop in an image. So for example, if you're trying to catch a runner in mid stride and just completely freeze them, and they appear floating in your image, you would probably need a shutter speed of at least 1,000th of a second. Conversely, if you're trying to get somebody who's just simply walking across the street, walking on the sidewalk, you can probably get away with shooting at 1/125th of a second to freeze them in motion. And when it comes to stationary targets, like doing landscapes or just shooting portraiture in a studio or something, or environmental portraits, you can get away with slower shutter speeds and still maintain sharp images. So on the flip side of shutter speed, the slower your shutter speed, the more motion blur is introduced into your images. So back to the running example, if you're trying to catch a runner mid-stride and you're using a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second or 1/125th of a second, you're going to start introducing motion blur in the arms and legs. Now we're going to check out some clips of me just simply waving to the camera, demonstrating different shutter speeds. So this first clip, I set the camera's shutter speed to 1/500th of a second, and as you look, my hand appears very jittery and jumpy as I'm waving it across the camera. In the second clip, I got the shutter speed now set to 1/25th of a second, and now you can really see there's a lot of motion blur as I'm waving my hand. And now we're going to put the clips side by side, and you'll definitely be able to see a difference in the amount of perceived motion as I'm just waving my hand. So the inclusion of motion blur in your images isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes you actually want to convey that feeling of motion or speed in your image. Another example of keeping a slow shutter speed is in some forms of landscape photography. So if you're trying to take a picture of a waterfall, by having a slow shutter speed, you're actually able to give the water a very smooth and silk-like appearance. Though when it comes to shooting at slower shutter speeds, do keep in mind the possibility of camera shake. What I mean by that is our hands, they're not 100% still. So any shaking or vibrations from your hands can introduce some blurriness into your image. So my personal rule of thumb when shooting handheld is to shoot no slower than 1/125th of a second. And that's because my hands are fairly shaky, and that shutter speed has given me good results so far. However, if you're shooting at a longer focal length, such as 200 millimeters, you want to bump that shutter speed up. Why that is because when you're shooting at a telephoto lens, things are magnified more. That includes the effect of camera shake. So a good rule of thumb for shooting with a telephoto lens is to shoot at double your focal length. So with your 200 mil lens, a good starting point is to shoot at 1/400th of a second. But of course, this rule of thumb really only applies to shooting handheld. If you're shooting on a good stable tripod, and shoot at whatever shutter speed that your image requires. The second impact shutter speed has on our images is the overall exposure. Shutter speed determines how much time light has to hit the sensor. So if the shutter is open longer, more light is able to hit the sensor. So for our images, the faster the shutter speed, the darker the image. The slower the shutter speed, the brighter the image. So back to the water pipe analogy I used for aperture. So let's say we put a valve on a pipe. If I open up the valve for a 500th of a second, I'm going to get a little bit of water. However, if I open up the valve for a whole second, I'm going to get a lot more water. So again, the faster, the darker, the slower, the brighter. So what if I'm trying to capture an image of a subject that's moving really fast? So I got the shutter speed of where I want it, and my subject is completely frozen the way I like it. But my images are still coming out too dark. Okay, now I gotta start getting to the other two settings of aperture and ISO to make up for the underexposure. So okay, what if my image doesn't require a very long depth of field? So now we can open up your aperture, shrinking the depth of field, but it's also letting in more light, upping your exposure. But images is still a little underexposed. So now we're gonna get into ISO to make up for the underexposure. And we'll get into ISO in the next video. Now grab your camera and throw it in shutter priority mode. Again, if you're shooting on Nikon, it's S mode. If you're shooting on Canon, it's TV mode. And start experimenting with different shutter speeds on different subjects going at different speeds. So for example, try catching a skateboarder mid-trick. Or maybe you're out at a ball game, try capturing your son or daughter throwing a ball at the ball game. Use your new knowledge of what shutter speed is to capture some of these fleeting moments.